So, welcome to Watercolours with Caroline. This week we are going to paint a sunrise in Nanaimo where I live. And this is a point down on the waterfront, a bench looking out towards the island of Newcastle Island and Protection Island and across to the pulp mill in the background. And I did wonder whether to put the pulp mill and the emissions from the pulp mill in, but it just seems such an integral part of Nanaimo and a really nice part of the painting. So it's in there. Get your paints ready and get some nice long format paper ready and we'll get painting. I have mine drawn ready here, and just like a lot of the other paintings that we did, we're going to start with a wet on wet background so we can get the colors in wet on wet. And what I want to do is I want to make sure I get this nice bright yellow in here. Now I've used Gamboge, but you can use any bright yellow for here. That's fine. And then I've used, just to change it up and use different colors this week, I've used Alizarin Crimson for the sunrise, but you can use permanent rose or you can use some other crimson, pinky color, whatever you like to use. One thing that you really need to do is to remember to leave along here. This is sort of cerulean blue, almost white paper. You need to make sure that you leave this nice, light, bright area. It's pretty critical to having, like, you know, dark, light, dark, light, dark. It's sort of critical to the composition. And it's where all the boats sort of are in the photographs. So be mindful of that as you put your paint on. And remember, the first layer can be nice and light, and then you can come back with a second layer. So I'm going to get my bigger brush. I'll use my silver black velvet, having talked about it. This is a mop brush I'm using. It's a 3/4 inch mop, and it's literally like a mop. You know, it holds lots of water. You can get the water down quickly, and it also has a lovely kind of point at the tip. Don't use it very often for small paintings. It's a little bit big for small paintings. So let's get that nice and wet. Don't be stingy on wetting your paper. I think sometimes you don't get them wet enough to actually get the colors to blend really well. So have a few goes over it, then lift it and make sure I can see it's not that wet in the middle there. Make sure that it's evenly wet and that it's going to hold that moisture for a while. And if you get anything like a little bit too much, you can grab a Kleenex and you can just mop up any extra and let it soak in a little bit. Don't just go straight in there with your paint. You can give it a minute or two to, especially if you wet it properly, you can give it a minute or two to soak in. Now I'm going to get my Gamboge, and I'm going to just see, I know I have a menu here that will mute you, but if you could mute yourselves, because I can't find my menu to mute you. I don't know where it's gone. Then I'm sure it's here somewhere. Oh, I'm going to mute all, okay, because we don't want any background noise. There we go. And I'm going to get some Gamboge, bring my palette over here. This is my Gamboge. I'm orangey yellow. Now, if you don't have Gamboge, remember you can mix a little bit of red with a little bit of bright yellow, and you'll get a Gamboge color. So we're going to start with that, and it's going to be right here where the sun is rising. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, make sure that's in focus. Right. Of course, I've put my palette about a mile away from me. Here we go. A little bit more. And you want some Gamboge in the water. You don't have to worry about the person or the seat or anything. They're all going to have dark paint on them, so you don't have to worry about them. I'm going to take the Gamboge over here a little bit, take it up in the sky a bit. And I want it so that I can actually blend the crimson in with it. Now, because your paper's wet, take your time. Don't rush with this stage. And I'm going to get my Alizarin Crimson. I bought a new one because I don't use it very often anymore. So I bought a new Alizarin Crimson to make sure I had a nice fresh one right out the tube. Don't have too much on your brush. I want to come into the yellow, coming in from the side into the yellow. Doesn't matter about those trees, you can go right over them. And I want to streak into that yellow with the crimson so that I get some mixing wet in wet. And if you've wet your paper properly, you shouldn't have any problems getting them to mix. If they're not mixing, if you're finding it's too dry, then you haven't wet your paper enough. You could go back still, there's time to wet it. I want to come over here again, because this is water and clouds. I want that horizontal side to side motion. And I don't want to forget, remember I said about leaving that nice light place where we can have very light cerulean blue. You can even leave some lights in the water. If they're too light, you can always cover them up later with some blue. There's no worries about that. We want to bring some into this gamboge in the center here. I mustn't forget to leave a light place. And if you do forget, quickly grab a Kleenex. I want to just take that up. Grab a Kleenex quickly and you'll be able to lift it off before it's dry. Alizarin stains a little bit, but it's not too badly staining. I'll take this across here. Now, if you have a good point on your brush, that's when you can get these nice thin pointy lines. Somehow, you know what, the phone hardly ever rings, but if I'm trying to make a video and I want no noise in the background, the phone always rings. Put that in. So I'm leaving a lot of space for the cerulean. I don't want to take this all up. And now I'm going to get my cerulean. Okay, so I have, now they're leaving a noisy message. I can't win. Okay, right. I'm probably have to maybe even have to edit all this phone out in the edit. So I'm going to make sure my cerulean's not too strong. And I'm going to start with the sky because that's where I want the cerulean the darkest. I'm going to put that in so that it just blends in with the crimson. I don't want it to blend too much with the yellow because I'll get green in the sky. So I want to be very careful. If you are worried about that, if you're worried about getting green, you can always do what's called buffering. If you put a little bit of alizarin between the yellow and the blue, that buffers it and just makes a light violet, which is the color we're going to use. And I'm going to switch to my number 6 brush, slightly smaller, because I want some control. And I want to really dilute that blue out, because this light area across here has to be almost white. So I want to dilute my cerulean down so that it's just about white. And remember, watercolor will dry much lighter, so it will lighten up as it dries, this light patch. I'm getting right here, I'm getting dry paper against wet paper, and I have to hurry now because I kind of waited while the phone was ringing and now my paper is drying up too fast. So I'm going to get a slightly darker blue, and I want to get this finished before my paper dries up, and I can go right over the rocks, right over the seat, right over the person. little bit more cerulean. Now, anytime this is not dark enough, we are going in with another layer to darken it up. So don't worry about it. And right here, I've got wet against dry because my paper's dried too much. And I can fix that a little bit with a little bit of alizarin coming across here. And later I will put some ultramarine blue there so it won't notice. It will be fine. The thing is, when you're working on wet in wet and you're working on your first wash like this, it's kind of important that you don't stop and you don't have any interruptions for anything. Even me, like worrying about filming, worrying about the phone is enough interruption to lose track of my concentration and what I'm supposed to be doing to get this done in one nice big wash, but it'll work. And I think if I wasn't actually teaching or filming, if I had to leave it, I would just walk away and leave it and restart, because you can kind of see up here, right here, I have where the dry paint is meeting the wet paint, and that is making a line, but it's going to be fine because I'm going to put on all these purple clouds and blue clouds that you won't see that. But it is a cautionary tale. Don't lose your focus when you're doing your first wet in wet wash. Right, for our triad today, we are going to look at the Alizarin Crimson, which we are using in the painting, and the Ultramarine Blue, which we're using in the painting. And I was going to try the Gamboge, but I gave it a test and it didn't really make very nice colors with the other two. Because it's a very orangey yellow, it just sort of didn't work very well. And I decided to switch at the last minute, I'm sorry, to either a transparent yellow or an azo yellow, because it just made better colors with the other two. The Gamboge I used in the painting because it's such a lovely bright sun color for that sunrise. And where are my yellows? So here are my yellows. And my favorite, the one that I use the most, is the M. Graham's Azo Yellow. And it's lovely and transparent. It's a really neutral middle yellow, mixes with everything. And the M. Graham paints are made with honey, so it's just a really lovely paint, and I use it all the time. PY 151, that's a good pigment too. So the Van Gogh one, so the M. Graham, just a little word on those, quite a big tube. They're about between $13 and $15 for a tube. Last a long time. Van Gogh is a student paint, very good quality. Quite a big tube, and they're about $5.50 a tube, so it's quite a big difference in price. The M. Graham's about 3 times as much for the professional quality, but the Van Gogh, as you can see, their transparent yellow is very close to the Azo yellow, and I think it's a really, really good yellow for mixing. I enjoyed it a lot. So then I've got the Winsor & Newton Windsor Yellow, which is a very pale lemony yellow, and the Van Gogh Lemon Yellow, which is a bit more opaque, you can see that. And the Van Gogh Azo Yellow Light, which is warmer, a little bit more orangey. And then we've got the Van Gogh Gamboge, which is that orangey yellow, and the M. Graham Gamboge, which is even more orangey. The Van Gogh Gamboge has yellow 154 and orange 48, and the M. Graham has a red 209 and a yellow 150, so they have a slightly different composition. And I'm trying them out over here mixed with ultramarine. So I want to go with a bright yellow. So if you don't have transparent yellow or azo yellow, you could try nickel azo yellow, or you could try a cadmium yellow. Or a permanent yellow. Those should all work. Or you can try the Gamboge. There's nothing wrong with trying the Gamboge and seeing what you get when you mix. Now I have this handy dandy little thing I picked up at the art store, and this actually, you can twist this wheel around, so it has triads here and then split complementary triads, so you're not having the exact primary colours, and it gives you your little triangle points to some suggestions. It's pretty basic. It's a watercolour one, so it shows you if you have a blue here and you add water in this little, sorry, it's a little shiny, in this little window here, it shows you what the blue looks like if you add water, and it shows if you add black. Well, I never add black with watercolour. I don't think many people do. This is adding blue, adding yellow, and adding red. So it gives you just a little colour wheel to help you with your colours. And on the back, you've got your complementary colours, your tetrads, your triads, and your split complementary triad. So it's kind of a useful little thing, but I think just trying it out for yourself like we do here is just as useful. Now let's see if I need to come in a little bit. Let's just come in a little bit closer so you can see what I'm doing. I will grab a paintbrush, and I'm going to always start with the yellow. Now I've got the two yellows here. This one here is the transparent yellow by Van Gogh, and I'm going to use that today. It's beautiful, bright, transparent yellow. And the Van Gogh paints, although they're a student quality and inexpensive, they have a very good light fast rating. And they have the light fast rating right on the tube. Three little plus signs is good. They have the transparency. This is semi-opaque. They have on the back, they have the pigment number. Everything is on here, and it's 10 milliliters, so that's quite a nice size tube. The Winsor & Newton Cotman is 8 milliliters, so you get a little bit more. They're both really good quality, but you can't go wrong with these Van Gogh paints. The only reason to go to a artist quality is to get maybe a more pigment rich color, or to get a real color, like not just a hue, not just something that's made up a little bit to look like something. But I think you can't go wrong with something like that. Beside it, I'll just put right here, I'll put the Azo Yellow from M. Graham. So you can see there's barely any difference. I would say the Azo Yellow is just slightly warmer. Now the Alizarin Crimson I'm using here is the Winsor & Newton Cotman. I didn't buy an expensive artist quality one because I don't use it very often anymore, and I really just didn't need to have an artist quality one. The Winsor & Newton Cotman, perfectly fine. If you're not selling your work for hundreds of dollars, you're not putting it in a gallery, you don't expect it to last for 100 years. You don't have to really worry about getting the artist quality until you're a really serious painter. So I've just got a little bit of that Alizarin Crimson out of the tube, and I've got it in this little palette because my other palettes are completely full. And I think I have some old Alizarin Crimson somewhere. Now the old one didn't used to be light fast. It was a lot of the reds and crimsons have difficulty being light fast. So people went away from using them, and now when they make them, they choose pigments that are more light fast, and they call them things like permanent alizarin crimson, so that you don't have to worry too much. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't see that one, about them fading. And Ultramarine Blue, my Ultramarine Blue I have now is by M. Graham. I like M. Graham and Winsor & Newton for their ultramarine. I find Winsor & Newton paints really clear, and they paint nicely. You get lovely, you know, even washes. They seem to go on well. Whatever their formula is, it's really nice for painting with. Sometimes I see posts on social media, and of course social media is very unreliable, but people say that they hate Winsor & Newton or they're no good, and I don't understand, because they've been around for a long, long time. They've been making artist quality paints for artists for over, I mean, a couple of 100 years. They are the industry standard. They are really, really good. And I can't see any reason why they wouldn't be acceptable paints. And I just know from experience they paint beautifully. So we're going to start with the yellow again, whichever yellow you want to use. And like I said, you can use the Gamboge because I did say we were going to. I just didn't like the mixes it made, and I didn't think they were going to be very helpful mixes. I thought mixing a green from these was much more helpful. So let's bring my mixing tray over. And remember what we do, we put the yellow first because it is going to get contaminated by the other paints. And I use my Van Gogh one for this. And then I'm going to get a fairly good amount of yellow, and then a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of Alizarin Crimson because it will soon overpower the yellow, so just a tiny bit. Could even go with more yellow. And we have our first mix for our bubble that's mostly yellow. So what we've got here is something very close to the Gamboge. I'm going to put Gamboge beside it so you can see that it's very easy to mix a Gamboge colour with pretty much any of your reds. They'll just mix a slightly different one, but the manufacturers use all different reds to make it. So let's grab my Gamboge and put that beside it so you can see that it's very similar. Maybe the Gamboge is a little bit, well, I've got an M. Graham Gamboge, so it's just a little bit more clear. I'm going to add a tiny bit more alizarin to it. Oh, and sometimes when you pick up the paint, you pick up too much. That was almost too much. Let's do the second one. And if you're not interested in the triads, if this isn't something that interests you in the middle of painting the Nanaimo sunrise, you can just skip this bit if you want to get back to the sunrise. What we're doing is we're waiting for paint to dry. I want that first wash to dry up and be ready to go. And I'll use my hairdryer a little bit. Plus you want your wash to sink in. You don't want to dry it too quickly because it won't sink right into the grain of the paper. And especially ultramarine blue, which floats on the surface for longer. So you need that to really get into the grain of the paper. So then we have our 3 dilutions there of and this, I'm using the Van Gogh transparent yellow for now, but you can use, I did use the Azo yellow the other day. So it's, the nice thing about the triads is you're just trying things out, trying it out, see what happens. Now, I've done that one, so I want to go, I can go down from the red or I can go across to the blue. I'm going to choose to go across to the blue for now. We're going to start with a fresh, clean area, and blue is very, very strong. So I just want to grab a tiny bit of blue. Oh, I grabbed too much. So immediately you get a bit of blue in there, it's already, I'm going to go back and get a bit of yellow. I'm going to have to get a lot of yellow. There we go. I want sort of a lime green colour. Now, ultramarine blue is a great blue for mixing all kinds of greens, but they will always be a natural green, a more olivey green often, because your ultramarine blue veers towards the red side of the colour wheel rather than the green yellow side. So you will get, if you want really natural looking leaves, that's a good one to go with. If you want a more acidy, strong green, then go with a yellowy blue like phthalo blue or Prussian blue. So I want to get just a little bit more blue. I don't want to overwhelm this yellow too quickly for my middle green right here. And I'm trying to paint carefully, so when I can't paint carefully and talk at the same time. It uses too much brain. So I just go a little bit quiet sometimes when I'm trying to be a bit careful with my brush. So that's our middle green there. And now I'm going to add quite a lot of ultramarine blue to get a much darker green. Oops, I've added a lot there. That's okay. A nice dark green. Swished quite a bit of blue in there, and already we've got. And look how lovely and clear these colours are. And even though it's a warmish blue, a sort of reddish blue, it's still making a lovely clear green. It's not making a muddy green at all. Now, when I mixed it with the Gamboge, because the Gamboge has red in it, we did get a very muddy green, and that's why I didn't like it as a triad, because I just got muddy colours with the red that was in the Gamboge, or the orange. So 3 lovely greens. Now, if you want to go even darker with your green, what you do is you add your complementary, you add a cool red like a crimson, and let's see how that goes. I've got my really dark blue-green here. Now I'm going to add in a little bit of Alizarin Crimson, and we're going to get a brownish green with this, but it's still going to be nice and dark. And a wonderful way to go dark with your greens is to add the complementary colour, because you will still have the nuances of green in there, but you will have something completely colourful and dark and different, rather than just a grey added to grey it down. And the other lovely thing you can do with your, looking for my green page, there we are, this page with a lot of greens on. It's going to come out a little bit. Now, so I've got a lot of greens I've tested on here. And if I just take my Alizarin Crimson and paint over that green with quite a diluted Alizarin Crimson, you don't want it too strong, I'm going to get lovely shadows in the green that go darker because I'm using the complementary colour over the top, especially if you've already got a dark green. I'll zoom in again so we can really see this one. So I have a good diluted Alizarin Crimson over the top of this green, and I can get a lovely, lovely dark, colourful shadow by doing that and layering it, especially if I layered it a third time just with blue, some ultramarine blue. Take that. I could layer it over, it has to be dry, but even if I just layer ultramarine blue over here, beside this, you can see that we get an even darker green. It's way nicer than putting grey over green or mixing grey with green. Let's get a Payne's grey, and let's put a Payne's grey over the green. It still darkens it up, you can still make it darker, but you kind of sap all of the colour out of it, and you don't get that kind of colourful transition of colours and layers. And of course we can add another dark green. This is just my dark green mix over the top. So it's not much different to adding grey over the top, but at least you have the nuances of colour in this dark green that I just mixed, rather than just grey. And layering your colours like this is a great way to get darks. So think about that. Think about not adding grey if you want to change the colour up a little bit. I'm just going to put that, I'm going to put a block in there. All right, so we've got our 3 greens, and now let's do our 3 purpley colours. So start with the red. That's going to be the best way to go. So I start. And remember, the blue overwhelms colours really quickly, so don't put too much blue in to start. Now try and get my palette where you can see it. There we go. So I got some red. Now I've got to get a little tiny bit of blue. Just a tiny bit. And I know that as I pick it up, it's probably going to be a little bit too much. There we go. That's going to give us a burgundy sort of colour. Now when you're using a reddish sort of blue like ultramarine or cobalt, you're going to get more grey violets. You're not going to get the stunning violets that you'll get if you use more of a yellow green like phthalo or Prussian. They will give you very, very clear, beautiful violet colours. But this one gives you more subtle grey violet colours, which are going to be perfect for our clouds, which are sort of a greyish violet colour. So tiny bit more ultramarine. It's really hard to get a tiny bit of paint on your brush. That's why this is such a good mixing exercise. And you can see it's kind of going that grey colour, but it still has violet undertones for sure. And this colour in the middle here is what we're going to use for most of the clouds. It's just a perfect colour for the sunrise clouds. And now we're going to go much darker with more blue. And none of them, like I say, are going to be a vibrant purple. I could add a tiny bit more. Well, so I'm just trying to get the ratio of blue to crimson correct for this one that's more of a lilac blue. And let's just water it down. So we've definitely got distinct 3 different colours, and you can see that the blue with the crimson is pretty subtle. Now let's just pull it out a little bit. We need to do our neutrals now. So you're going to try and mix equal amounts of each colour for the neutrals. So to do that, what I kind of do is I kind of swish my brush twice in a colour and put it down. Swish it twice in another colour and put it down. And then again twice in the other colour and put it down. And we should get something that's sort of a grey colour, greenish grey. And if you wanted a little bit more grey, I just added a little bit more blue, just to get it. And now I'm adding a little bit more crimson. I'm trying to get it sort of right, that kind of just base grey. Nice colour. We're going to use these 3, well, we're actually going to use the Gamboge for our dark colour, but this is what we're going to use in the painting to get our dark silhouette colour. With using less water with our mix so that it's nice and strong. So at one end of my neutral, I've added water so we get nice light grey, and then at the other end, I've tried to get it full strength. So now we're going to add one. We're going to have the pink, the crimson and the yellow, just a little bit of each. I'm using the same well here. And we're going to get lots of blue with that. So when we make our dark for the silhouette, we're going to really use a lot of blue to make the silhouette very dark. So let's look at the one that's mostly blue. And that's what we're going to use for the silhouette colour, the nice dark colour in our painting. And when we use the Gamboge with that, it'll make it even more dark. Give it a bit more power. And this is a lovely, lovely grey. You can mix, anytime you mix your 3 primary colours, you're going to get some kind of a grey. And depending on what the primary colours are made from, you might get a very light, warm grey, or you might get a very cold, dark grey. It just depends on the colours you're using. So this time I better start with a clean palette for this one. It's always difficult to find a clean palette. We'll clean a little area up. So we want one that's mostly red. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a little tiny bit of yellow and a little tiny bit of red. No, I'm going to not red. I'm going to start with a little tiny bit of blue. And get that tiny sort of green mix going. And then I'm going to get a good brush full of red. And then we're going to make a lovely, lovely, rich, warm brown with this. Now remember, every week we do these triads, we get some beautiful browns mixing our colours that are mostly red. So you can see how you really don't need to buy, I don't think, more than one brown. I like to have a burnt sienna because it is a truly beautiful brown. But this is pretty close. And you can mix a burnt sienna with any type of blue to make a darker, different brown. And you can also mix it with the yellow and the red to make all kinds of beautiful browns. But this one is rather gorgeous, and it's very close to burnt sienna. I'm going to put some burnt sienna beside it. The burnt sienna, my Winsor & Newton one, is much clearer than this because it's one pigment. And when we're mixing this one, we're mixing 3 pigments. Anytime you mix 2 or 3 pigments, you're going to get something much more muddy, much more opaque, much more dense. So a single pigment paint is your best buy because they are clear and they're easy to mix with other paints, because then you don't have a mix that's too heavy on pigments. Last one, we want to have mostly yellow in the last one, so we'll start with a little bit of red, just a tip of red on my brush and a little tip of blue on my brush. And of course blue is very strong, so then we want to get a good brush load of yellow. And we're going to be having a colour that's a little bit like a raw sienna or a yellow ochre or a raw umber. We're going to get a lovely earthy yellow. Now let's put that in mustardy, very like strong mustard sort of colour. Add some water to that to lighten it up. And there we have our just our basic 4 neutrals. So that's your triad for this week. Every week I'm going to try and marry the triad to the painting a little bit. And I know I went a little bit off this week by not using the Gamboge. But I can't remember what I did with my trial one. It just didn't look very inviting. So this is a better one for you to have as a reference. And just remember what a lovely dark green you can mix with these 3. Very natural green, like the trees that you see around. Okay, and now we're going to go back to our Nanaimo sunrise. It should be almost dry. I'll give mine a good going over with the hairdryer, and it should be ready for the next stage. You don't want any of this paint bleeding up into the sky. Now we're going to work on dry paper, and we're going to take the Ultramarine Blue and we're going to really dilute it to make the background mountains. We don't want this paint to be very thick. And a small brush. I'm looking at my number 4 brush. I'm thinking a number 4 brush is going to be plenty big enough to do these background mountains. So I'm going to get my blue. I'm going to bring my tray over so you can see that I'm going to get a very thin mix. So I put my blue down and I'm going to add water to it. And then I'm going to test it, grab myself a bit of paper to test it on. And I'm going to see how dark it is. Might add a little bit more water. These are really in the background, so we don't want this to be strong. So it sort of looks like this, quite watery. And little brush because we have to really control these brush strokes. Now the place where I really want this mountain to show is in the background here, but we're going to cover everything. But I'm going to put it back here first. And then I'm going to pull my brush sideways to make sure I get a really nice straight line along that horizon, because this is kind of important to have a straight line there. I need a little bit more paint, and I want to connect up that with paint from this side. Now, I'm using the point of my brush. This is why it's really good to have a brush with a nice point. Using the point of my brush to poke the tops of the trees up, and then I want to connect with the bottom. So point, poke the tops of the trees up with the point of the brush, and then connect with the bottom of that island. Now, like I said, we're going to come back over this with darker paint, but the reason we're doing it all in one go is so that you don't have weird lines between the mountains in the background and these islands in the foreground. If you just do the mountains in your background, you're going to have weird dry lines where you've painted the background mountains. The other thing is, if we already put a layer of light ultramarine blue on these trees, you're going to have an easier job getting your foreground trees to be nice and dark, because you'll already have a layer of blue on there. Even though it's quite a light layer, it'll already be there. Now, this blue should be transparent. It should not be thick. So it should be really see-through. You should be able to see, I can see my red through it here. I won't when I put the darker color on, but I can right now. So that's how thin it needs to be. It does not need to look, I'm going to show you how it shouldn't look. It should not look like this. It shouldn't look like that. It should look really transparent so you can see through it. So let's take that down with some water, and this is how it should look when you've taken it down with some water. Now, see what I mean about dry lines? If we paint just the background mountains first, we're going to get dry lines showing through, which we don't want. So now I've got a big splat of blue on there. Now another splat of blue. Wonderful. So while that's drying, we've got lots of other dry paper that we can work on. We can work especially on the color in the water here. We can put some little clouds in the sky, which is what we could start with. So we start here on the foreground. There's a tendency to smush all of that when you do the sky. So let's have a look at the sky. I'm going to mix that ultramarine blue with a little bit of alizarin to make a sort of a gray lilac color for the clouds. So get a little bit more blue, a little bit of alizarin, until we get a sort of a gray purple that we can use for the clouds. And then I'm going to take that same brush, and I actually, you know what, I'm going to have to turn it upside down. It doesn't matter which way up you do this, but it's going to be a lot easier for me to do upside down. And I want to start with some little thin clouds just over here. So I can put them on dry paper, coming in, just coming into the yellow. Don't like cover up your yellow. And I can take some up into the blue sky. I'm going to come back with some more pinky clouds in a moment on the blue sky. And the way I can make those sort of meld into the sky is to get my wet brush and just take my wet brush, no paint on my brush at all. And I can just paint along those lines I've made, just softening them and making them a bit more cloudy. I'm going to add a little bit more crimson to my mix so that I have a more pinky cloud, and take some pinky clouds up here. That the mix now on the edge has a little bit of crimson added to it. So it's not absolute crimson, it's crimson with a tiny bit of blue in, like your first mix on your triad near the crimson. And I'm going to put in a few crimson clouds up here and coming down here. And again, if they feel a bit too hard edged, I'm going to take, you don't have to always take your wet brush, but if you want to soften some of them in, with a brush that's just a little bit wet. I'm going to take just pure crimson now, just hold this over here so you can see, just crimson by itself, but not really, really strong, diluted, of course. And I maybe want a few more crimson clouds into the yellow sunrise. Now this is when you can work wet on dry, just really controlling your sky and your clouds. Your first wet in wet is out of control. It does what it wants to do. But this one, you can manipulate it. You can tell it what to do. You can pull in a little bit more dark in the way of clouds here. And because I've already got wet on there from my brush, now this is sort of doing a wet in wet thing, which is lovely. I'm going to switch back to a little bit more crimson. Now, don't overdo this. Don't keep doing it until you have no blue sky left. That's not going to be as beautiful. I'm reaching the point now where I want to do the other side. I'm going to start with, now what I'm going to be putting a lot on the other side is the emissions from the pulp mill. So I don't need to do as much over here, but I'm definitely going to put a bit more crimson over here. Want some stronger crimson clouds that are going to go underneath that much darker smoke. So back and forth with the crimson. A little bit in the top of the sky. I'm not going to do too much in the top of the sky because, like I said, I want that smoke happening. So just a little bit of the darker crimson. Then I want to turn it up the right way just to make sure I've sort of got as much as I want to put on for now. Let's check it out and see. I maybe have a little bit more in here. Just the crimson on my brush. Every one that you do is going to turn out differently. And then I think I can now leave that for a minute and I can work on this in the foreground here. So in the foreground, over on the right-hand side, I've got more ultramarine blue, pretty much ultramarine blue in this mix. And then on the left-hand side, I've got the ultramarine blue and the alizarin first. And then when that's dry, we're going to come in with the really, really dark mix. So we've got a couple of steps to this. So I'm going to start off on the left side so that I don't get my arm in everything. And again, it's the same colors. You want some that's just alizarin on its own, some that's alizarin with some ultramarine blue, but heavy on the alizarin, and then some that's ultramarine blue and alizarin, but heavy on the blue. So that we've got three different mixes to work with. And remember that you want to leave that. I'm going to start, even though this is going to go darker, I'm going to start with the area near the light that is really dark. I'm going to start with that. We're going to go darker later, but I'm going to put that on to remind me that's my area where it's going to go dark to light. And switch up to the more crimson-y mix. And we don't want to do this too quickly. We don't want to go too covered up too quickly. You want to really think about it, take your time, because there's nothing worse than having a lovely light background that suddenly gets totally covered with darker color so that you can't see the light background. Now, as we come closer to the shore, I'm going to put some crimson on. Always go horizontal. I've got my wet brush to just wet those in a little bit. Here, I think we go a little bit. And if you are using rose, and use rose, that's fine. If you like rose mixed with a little bit of yellow to make your rose more orangey, that's fine too. All we want is some beautiful colors in the sunrise. So I've got the crimson and the crimson and blue mix. And now I'm just going to go with ultramarine blue. just ultramarine blue on its own. So I've got a third little place here on my palette with some ultramarine blue. And again, not too dark. And I want to put some bluer waves in here, closer to the shore and closer to the chair, the seat. Take it easy, go slow, put a little bit in at a time. Use your wet brush to wet those colors in. Have them blend. I'm going to take a little bit of the purple and a little bit more purple. And just stop, because I will be coming in with more darks over here. I don't want to get carried away. On this side, I'm going to do the same thing. And remembering that I want this nice light patch back here. I don't want to have anything disturbing that. Putting in the purples. Make sure I leave some yellow and pink showing. Put in a little bit more pink, crimson. Use my wet brush to soften it in. I'm going to get the ultramarine blue diluted and have some waves over here. I'm going to get a little bit of the cerulean. I just want the cerulean a little bit darker over here. Remember, the rocks don't matter, they're going to get dark, much darker, but I just want my cerulean over here just a little bit darker. And the ultramarine. Now, at this point, with the pure ultramarine, we're going to start getting a little bit darker where we're reflecting. What we're doing is we're reflecting these clouds of emissions here. So we can get a little bit darker with the ultramarine. We also want to keep some light showing in between those strokes. So don't forget to have a little bit of light showing. I'm going to get the more purpley ultramarine for the ones back here. And again, the more purpley one with the alizarin and ultramarine mix. And we have what I want to put in at this point. I'm going to my number 2 brush. I'm just going to switch. And I have, for this one, I've got the ultramarine blue and the alizarin mix to make that sort of a purpley color. And what I want to put in is the smokestacks from the pulp mill just back here. Just kind of like this, because I want to know where they're going to reflect in the water. So I don't want to put the reflections in the wrong place on this. So I'm probably would be helpful if I grab the photograph. This is the actual photograph. Now, where the reflections meet the horizon here, you can see a little bit of the smokestack reflection. Then you get this light area, and then you have this area here coming to like a mushroom cloud of smoke. So I want to try and have that same thing happening. So I've got reflections kind of here, and then a break, and then kind of reflections here, and then they blur out into, I'm just going to blur the edges and add a little bit more blue to the edges here, where they really, really blur out into a lot of smoke reflection. And I'm not going to put quite as much as the photograph has. I want to have a little bit more color showing. But if we don't have some contrast between light and dark, you lose the drama of the whole painting. What I don't want to do is I don't want to take the dark right up to the dark coat of the person, because otherwise we're not going to have a transition between the light and dark. So I want to make sure that I keep that nice and light beside the coat. Now I'm just going to wet this a little bit so it's not so sharp. So I soften it a little bit. And I've wet some of this area so it's a little softer. And you don't have to have it exactly like mine or exactly like the photo. As long as you have this back and forth wave pattern, and as long as you have a mass coming under the cloud, then that's good. You'll be fine. Just try and remember right here beside the person, keep it light so that we have here light against dark. We can see light against dark. It's kind of important. And in the sky, we want that same crimson and blue mix. And if on the photograph, it gets bluer and bluer as it goes up in the sky. So we can start with the purpley mix and then we can get bluer as we go up in the sky. Now you need a bigger brush to make the big cloud formations. I'm going to go to looking at this one, I like my number 8 brush. So I'm going to switch to my number 8 brush. 6 or an 8 is good. I don't want to be too twee with these clouds. I think that would be, it won't work out as well. I want to be a little bit more loose with them. So again, I'm just making sure I've got a bit more of the purpley blue mixed up. And now I'm going to work on the clouds. So they're kind of going off to the left a little bit. And I'm going to soften them all with water when I get them going in there. So off to the left a little bit with the cloud. Push my brush down and get a little bit of blue on my brush now, just ultramarine blue. And I'm going to shove those clouds out to the side. And then pull them up into the sky. And I'm quiet because I'm having to really think about this as I go. Now I want just blue. I might even put a little bit of cerulean with my ultramarine to lighten that blue as it comes up to the top of this cloud. I mixed a little bit too much, actually, too much cerulean with my ultramarine. Just getting a little bit of water to dilute it down. And I'm taking that up to this sort of cloud mass up here, so it's more blue. And pulling that out with the point of my brush. Now, when you're doing this on dry paper, it's kind of intimidating because you've got to put some really dark color on dry paper. But you can always come back with your wet brush and soften a few of those clouds. I want to take that right to the tape there. Don't use too much wet brush though, because what you'll get is you'll get lots of run backs into your clouds, which will give you blooms. And the paper's dry, so I can fiddle with this for a while. I can put in some thin clouds. I'm going to switch to my little number 2 brush because I want to have some thin wispy bits. There's some wispy bits coming off here. I'm going to get my little thin brush and wisp these clouds out a bit. And you'll probably find as it dries that they're lighter than you thought they were going to be. And they're not as scary once they start to dry. And now what I'm doing now is charging color into the bottom of the cloud. Taking a little bit of the alizarin and the blue. I might even add a little bit of the azo yellow into the crimson and the blue, because I think I would like the bottom of the cloud to be a little bit more dark. So I've got a little bit of azo yellow in with the crimson and the blue, and I'm just dabbing it into that wet cloud to darken the bottom a little bit. And of course, I might want to darken this area, but I don't want to do that right now because it's too wet still, but it's drying, and it's a really dangerous stage to put anything in when it's wet but just drying. I could put this in at the bottom of the cloud here because it was still wet, and I can still manipulate this with a wet brush a little bit, but I don't want to go down here, because if I put anything down here in the paint that's drying up, I'm going to get some rumbacks and some mess down there, so I won't do that. I'm sort of testing to see what everything else is looking like before we go to the much darker areas. Also, you might feel at this point that I'm feeling that my sun's a bit wishy-washy. My sunrise is a bit wishy-washy. Before I put in all the darks, I could put in, this is dry enough, I could put in a little bit more bright sunlight. Let's get some Gamboge. Gamboge on my number 6 brush, and a bit of water so I can manipulate it. And I'm thinking like right here and right here, it's a bit stronger. Now I've just got a wet brush now, clean wet brush, clean and wet. And I'm just going to move that with the clean wet brush. Just put a bit more color from the rising sun. I noticed that in the photograph, the color from the sun is very pink. It's very pink under this cloud here. So I might add a bit more here too, a bit more pink. I'm to be very careful doing that because of the cloud, which is wet. But I just feel like I want to have it a bit more pinky, a bit more orange, a bit more color, just right there. And I'm just going to make sure I manipulate that in with a damp, slightly damp brush, a little bit more color. Right now, before I go on, before I do any more, I definitely want to dry mine because I don't want to start putting any dark paint on. Don't want to put any dark paint on near that yellow I just put on. Made a line here across the mountain, which I don't like. I'll have to just fix that with a little wet brush and a Kleenex. Kleenex is your friend. Just don't want that yellow over the top of those mountains too much. Or that pink. I just want to keep them so that they're more blue. But I don't want to put any other paint on here while this is all wet or even damp. I want to make sure it's perfectly dry. I'm going to let you catch up, and I'm going to pause for a minute and use my hairdryer and get that nice and dry. So we want a nice dark color for all of the silhouetting, and you still need a liquid paint for that, but it has to be less water than your other mixes have been. So I'm going to start with the Gamboge. We're going to use the Gamboge because it's a nice dark yellow, and it will make a darker mix. And we're going to get a good amount of that first, and I'll add some Alizarin Crimson to it. I'm not washing my brush in between. Now, It may make your paints a bit dirty to grab your paint without washing your brush, but every time you wash your brush between paints, you add water to the mix, and you're never ever going to get a dark mix by doing that. You'll just always get a thin mix of paint if you are too clean about grabbing paint. So what I do is I clean my paints after I've done all this. So I didn't go into my water. I grabbed my blue with my dirty brush, and it will all be fine in the end. That's why you start with the lightest yellow. I started with the Gamboge. It keeps it clean. My bit of crimson's looking a bit messy. That's okay. I'll clean it up later. And the blue is fine. The blue can take care of itself. It can have all colors mixed in. So I want to get a lot of blue in there, a little bit of water. And don't stir and stir and stir and stir your paint, because look, it's diluting it. It's diluting it all. What you want to do, that's what not to do. What you want to do is keep it all together in a small pile. I've diluted mine now. So don't swish it around. Don't stir it like it was a pudding. Keep it all together. I'm just adding a bit more crimson, a bit more blue, and it's got to be, and a little bit more water. It's got to be liquid enough that you can paint with it. And you have to have enough mixed up that you've got a good color there. I'm going to add a little bit more crimson, just going into the crimson with my dirty brush. A little bit more blue maybe, and I think we're just about there. It makes a really, really dark gray. Now, I'm going to start with the faraway trees, and I want my smaller brush for that. So I use my number 4. It's nice to use the same brush that you mix with, because the brush is filled with paint. And get my scrap paper here. So the brush is filled with paint already, and it's kind of a waste not to use it, but I can't do those. I can't do those faraway trees with that big thick brush. So this is my number 4, and make sure you load your brush. That means like roll it in your paint. This is where the good brushes are your friend, because they hold a lot of paint and they're not going to run out on you. Oh, the other thing is, before I forget, if you don't have a steady hand and you want a nice sharp horizon line, you can put a piece of masking tape across that horizon line. If your paper's dry, your paper has to be dry to do this, by the way. It's got to be bone dry. So you can put your masking tape across there, and that will help you get a lovely straight horizon line with no bleeding of paint down into the water. Now, again, I'm going to use the tip of my brush to poke those trees up to start with, and then come down and fill them in. Don't go along poking all your trees up and come back and fill them in later, because they'll be dry already and you'll have lines all the way across. You need to, I'm going to add a little bit more blue to my mix. You need to poke them up for about ½ inch, couple of centimeters, and then you need to come back and fill them in before your paint dries. Now, if you've got the consistency of your paint right, it should flow off of your brush with no streaks, no brush strokes, no dry paint marks, nothing. It should just flow off of your brush easily. And keep loading your brush. Keep loading it up and getting more paint. Now, don't remember these mountains in the background. They are going to stay pale ultramarine blue. We're not going to paint over them in the second round here. My brush has got a little distressed at the tip there. We're going to just paint down here, the islands that are much, much closer. So they will be much darker, and they are very silhouetted in this sunrise photograph. So go along. Don't forget to straighten up the bottom so that even though you've got tape there, it's easy to forget to make sure that you actually straighten up the bottom and come right to the tape. Nothing worse than pulling your tape off later and finding that you've got little white spots where you didn't connect. We come along here. And we put the smokestacks are actually behind these pieces of land that have trees on. There's many pieces there. There's different islands. There's Jack Point over here. Then they're all over. So there we've gone all the way across. And look now how light that ultramarine blue looks. Now we've got this dark paint in. Really, really light. Now don't take that tape off for a little while, because if you take it off when this paint's all wet, it's going to you're going to get a bleed through, or you're going to get something happening. And if you push down under your tape too much with wet paint, it will bleed through. I don't use this very much because I want to have a little bit more control, and I'm worried that I will get a bleed through of paint. So I try not to. I'm going to do a little bit more on the smokestacks just there, just to give them a bit more definition. But I'm going to have to take this off to do the reflections in the water. And I definitely want to do those before I do any foreground. Otherwise, I'm going to be smushing it with my hand. So this is my number 2 brush. And I'm going to put that the little marker boy here. It's very tiny, and there's a little reflection just there. And there's another one over here, very tiny, just like little dots. There's a boat over here that you can barely see, just kind of do a general boat shape. Tiny, tiny boats over here. Again, just general boat shapes. And there's something here. Just looking at the photograph, same dark color. There's a boat over here too. So if you've got any blips in your horizon line here, you could always turn it into a boat or something over there. And there's something in the water here, and there's something in the water over here too. And just put those little tiny details in, and that's all good. So now we need to work on the bench. And I've got my number 2 brush in my hand, and I've still got lots of that dark paint left. So I'm going to, I think the number 2 brush is going to be good for this. I'm going to put very, very carefully put the bench slats in. And like I said, I'm not going to paint the steel posts. I usually have to hold my breath when I do something like this, because they are quite straight and they're quite tiny. So top one's in, and there's this middle one. I'm skipping the pole. I'm going to do that after these are dry. The color won't be too different, but it will look separate. Every time the paint dries, you get a separation line in the paint. And I have to keep dipping in my paint. You can't paint all this without re-dipping. And your paint should still be nice and wet, like a nice big puddle. If it's not, mix up some more so that it's nice and wet. Don't mix up more in the middle of painting a line, Wait till you've at least painted a line or an area before you stop, mix up some paint. Otherwise you will get a dry line right in the middle of what you're doing. Now, I want the top of the seat to be reflecting the blue, so it's light. There was just a tiny reflection on the photo. I just accentuated it for the painting because I wanted to have a bit more. Well, it's hard to paint a tiny area anyway, so it was easier to paint a very small amount. Now I put all the slats of the bench in. Now, I don't have enough paint left to do the rocks in the front in one go. So it would be silly to start painting the rocks in the front without mixing up some more paint. I'm not going to mix with my little brush. It'll damage the little brush. Let's get a bigger brush and let's start the mixing process again. Start with Gamboge. Get some crimson. Don't wash my brush. We're running out of crimson. I'm going to have to wet my brush to find. I've got another crimson somewhere. Oh, there it is. Another one over here. To wet my brush to activate it. And now we want some ultramarine blue. A little bit of water. A little bit more water. I want it to be at least liquid, this paint. I don't want to be struggling with that. And I don't want to be swishing it all around like I'm mixing a pudding, remember? Now, I have paint on this great big brush, my number 8 brush, and I don't want to waste any of that paint, and I'm not doing little tiny details. So this is a great time to just use the brush that I've mixed with to paint these dark rocks. They're big and they're in the foreground. Now, the only thing I need to remember is to poke the point of my brush up to get the nice jagged edge of the rock. Make sure I just lift it up and get the point just there. And then I can push my brush down to what's called the belly of the brush, the big part of the brush, to get the paint on the rest of the area. If your brush doesn't have a nice point, find a little brush or a square brush even. Let me get my square brush. If you have a square brush, you can use that to get the edges of your rocks in more sharply, if that's easier for you. I just love working with round brushes and a good point on the brush, so I prefer to just, plus this round brush is holding 3 times the amount of paint and water that my square brush will hold. So I will be able to work all the way across here with no brush marks or lines showing. Start with the pointy, jagged part of the rock, and then come down and fill the rest in. I'll move it over a little bit. I know it's shiny under the camera. It's because the paint's very wet, and that is the key. If you're seeing streaks in your paint, it's because it's not wet enough. And come down this side here. And down here, the edge right there. And don't go back over it. If you go back over it, you will definitely get a horrible brush stroke. And what you will do is you'll lift paint off of there rather than put paint down if you go back over it. You need to let that just soak in all by itself. And I'm sorry it's a bit shiny, but that's because it's wet. I'll tip it a little bit so it's not glaring under the light. And if you notice, you can't see a brush stroke anywhere because the paint is just the right consistency. Thick, quite a lot of paint and not much water, but enough water that, look, it's still wet the whole way. It's wet from where I started, it's wet to where I finished. So it keeps really, really wet. And that's the way to get a good layer of paint on. Now I have a little tiny script liner brush. And if you look at the photo, underneath the bench here is some weeds poking up. I kind of like that. I kind of like the hard rocks, the man-made bench, and then the weeds. So I'm going to, don't squish my wet paint. I've got my script liner and I'm going to just pull it upwards from the ground with that very fine script liner and put in the weeds. Now this, at the beginning we were talking about brushes, and most of my brushes are silver black. I've got to get it right. Sometimes I say silver black velvet. Sometimes I say black silver black velvet. And the ones that I love that are Princeton Velvet Touch are these script liners. They're a man-made one. They're only a few dollars. They're just, I really, really love how nice and sharp the point of these stays, the way you can do some little really fine lines with them. Even if you wanted to do like a line across here, they're really lovely if you pull the brush line across the top of the bench here. They are a bit wiggly. They're better for things like weeds, I have to say. And pop those on. Now we're almost finished. What you have to be very careful of when you have all this wet is not to smush your wrist in it when you're painting something else. The bench, I'm sure, is dry enough to paint the little person. And my paint here is wet and I have to be super, super careful. I want to add to my dark color, I want to add a little bit more gamboge to it. I want to make it a little bit more browny, just a slightly different color and a little bit of water to it before I paint the person. Now, if I was painting by myself, not teaching a lesson or not constrained by time, I would just walk away at this point and make a cup of tea and do something else and leave it for half an hour to really dry off by itself and settle in, because I know I'm bad at getting paint all over things. And watercolor paint really benefits from just being left alone to dry by itself and sink in the paper, rather than even the hairdryer. The hairdryer is convenient for class and for finishing a painting, but what the hairdryer does is it evaporates the moisture, the water, before the paint has had time to get down into the pores of the paper and sink in. What you're doing with the hairdryer is just sealing up the paper again. You're shrinking it up and closing the grain of the paper before the paint has sunk in. And that's not a good thing. It's just helpful when you're teaching a class, that's all. But if you can walk away and let it dry naturally, that is much, much better. So I'm nattering while I'm giving it a chance to sink in too. And I want to get my arm up here, so I'm not going to squish. And I'm going to start with her hat. And I know that it has stripes going around it, so I'm going to actually paint it with stripes going around, as if I'm not sort of able to really paint stripes, but I'm painting in that direction. I'm trying to leave just a little bit of light showing to get, and I can lift some paint off in a minute to get some extra light showing. And I'm going to get that very thin script liner. And I'm just going to do the wisp of her hair out the side of the hat here with one little wisp of my script liner. And then the coat's sort of, you know how you huddle up your collar, coat's kind of huddled up. And then I put the rest of her. Again, you have to go really slowly. I'm using my number 2 brush, my 2 round, and I'm slowly, carefully painting in the figure. You have to go carefully because just one little slip and too much paint, and you have an odd, very odd looking figure, odd looking shape. So you don't even really want to go a millimeter over the line where you should. Really concentrate. Little point of the brush, but it's good to have a good brush. And go slowly. There's no need to go fast. Even if you think, well, I'm going to put that in after the Zoom class is finished, I'm not going to rush it and do it now. That is a good idea. Now I have to make sure that the bottom of her arm and jacket match up. Even though there's a bench in the way, they have to match up on the other side of the, on the opening of the bench. They can't come in and out at different points. I'm getting down to the legs, the pants and the boots. They kind of like, how you, little bit of a wrinkle in the pants as they come down to the boots here. Jacket kind of sticking out a little bit. I keep checking, making sure I haven't put my wrist in my paint, which I am wanting to do. I think I've managed so far not to, which is a good thing. There, now I've got that paint on, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift a little bit off. I've washed my brush, just dried it on my Kleenex, and I'm going to lift a little bit. I'm drying that on my sponge, a little bit off of the side here, a little bit off the collar, a little bit off the hat, just lifting a little bit off. It's a great thing about ultramarine blue. It's a good color to lift, and if you mix it with the other colors, it keeps them liftable for longer. It's because some colors float and they're lighter and they float on the surface of the paper for much longer, whereas your staining colors are much heavier. They will sink into your grain really quickly and you won't be able to get them out. So you can just, it gives you time to really manipulate your paint for things like wrinkles, hats, rocks. And just lift a little bit of that color off, just gives her some form and makes her look a little bit more three-dimensional. Of course, later, after it's dry, you can also put a bit of blue shadow on. If you feel that it needs blue shadow, then you can definitely add it later. That's fine. There's almost nothing left to do now except the steel poles on the bench. And of course, I can't do the right-hand one while the coat and everything is wet paint, but I can do the left-hand one to show you how I would do that. So I'm going to mix a different light gray. I'm going to use the Cerulean Blue instead of the Ultramarine Blue this time to make a more of a steely sort of gray. I've got some cerulean over here still. So I'm always mix with a bit bigger brush. Don't wreck your small brushes mixing. So I'm going to activate that Cerulean Blue again. Maybe a little bit more. I don't need lots, but want enough. And then a little bit of the Gamboge and a little bit of the Crimson. And we're going to mix a gray. We're going to have to keep going. This is not gray enough yet. So a little bit more cerulean. And now it's looking gray. So it was cerulean, Gamboge, and a little crimson, and then back to the cerulean until we get a gray, steely gray color. And back to my tiny brush, my little 2. And I'm just going to do one of these poles because the other one is, the paint's too wet. Now we're going to put that on. And the other part of the pole comes down here into the rock. I went and sat on the bench and checked it out and made sure I got all the details right, because it's sometimes difficult to see from a photograph and you're not always sure if you remember it correctly. So yeah, I don't want to, I'm not going to put it on next to the coat. I can see it's shiny still. It's not dry, but of course you'd do the other pole the same as this one. And what I'm doing now is the pole is starting to dry. So I'm wetting my brush and I'm just drying my brush so it's damp, and I'm going to lift a little bit off on the right hand side so it's a little bit lighter, and I need to make it a little bit darker on the left hand side. So I'm going back to my mix, my dark mix that I use for the rocks, which is lightening up a bit now, but that's okay. All I want it for is a little bit of shadow on the left side of this pole, because it's a round pole on the back of this bench. And by highlighting one side and darkening the other, you make it look a little bit round. Also, I just need a slightly less of a gap between the two parts of the bench there. You can put any of the shadows on the pole after everything is dry. That's easy to do too. You can lift the color off when it's dry. Cerulean blue will lift beautifully. You can lift a lot of it off, and all of the other colors, if they're mixed with the cerulean, will lift when it's dry. No problem. So I'm just going to leave that one other pole until her coat is dry, and that is pretty much the painting finished. If when it's all dry, you feel like you want a bit more color anywhere, you can do that. You can add more color later after everything's dry. I'm just adding a little bit more. I've got alizarin and ultramarine, and I'm just thinking over here on my other one, it's much darker over here. So I'm just going back with a little bit more alizarin and ultramarine to just darken that area up a little bit more, make it a little bit more dramatic, just over on that side. I had a little bit of a squitch there with my tape, but I won't worry about that too much. And grab a bit more ultramarine there. Just be careful if you're adding darks after, just be a little bit careful that you don't overdo it, that you don't add too much and start getting like muddy areas. But it's a good time when everything's getting close to finished that you can then judge a little better where you might need some more darks. I just want a few more waves over here. And when everything's in there, all your darks and lights are in there, then you can start to see where you might need a couple more. Just want to blend that one in a little bit more with a wet brush. And I have just a couple more at the side here. And then I think I'm pretty much done mine. I'm going to zoom back a little bit so you can see it from a distance a bit more, not so close up. And I won't take the tape off yet because my rocks are not dry. I can see the paper is still bowed up a little bit, which means there's still quite a lot of moisture in it. So I don't want to, I got a big blob of water on there. Kleenex is your friend. Yeah, put that on there and that's all fixed. So yeah, I want to leave my tape on for at least an hour or two until it's dry, and you can have a look at the other ones. And of course, when you take the tape off, you get that lovely crisp dry edge. And if your tape's not holding well, I usually have about 5 millimeters, which is about 1/4 of an inch. If your tape's not holding well, then have a 1/2 inch around the edge. That looks just as nice to have a wider edge to your paper, and it will hold it a bit better. Also, I have this beauty tone. This is from the paint store this much wider tape. It's got to measure it to see how wide it is. It's an inch. It's about 1.5 inches, close to 1.5 inches. This, of course, holds even better if you've got a bigger piece of paper, but this Dollarama tape works pretty well. So there we go. I hope yours is turning out well. I just need to put the finishing touches on this, which is the pole here that I've put in with a light grey, and I want to put a slightly darker grey on the left side so that it's more shaded. So I'm just going to get our grey mix, which is the blue and the crimson and a little tiny bit of the Gamboge, and get my dark grey mixed up with a little bit of paint. And I want to just get shadow on the underneath of this and the left side, and there are a couple of like little bolts sticking out here. Let's zoom in a little bit so you can see a little better about what I'm doing. There we go. So it's a very, very tiny little detail, so you definitely want to work on like dry paper, and a little bit on this side. And I had to wait till everything was dry to do this. I couldn't do this on wet paper. And the person that's sitting there, I can put a little bit more shadow on them now they're dry, just to get them a little bit darker in places. And the other thing you can do is lifting out. Now I have a special little tiny lifting out brush which I bought from a website, the Billy Shower website. It's specifically designed to be nice and stiff and little for lifting out paint. So maybe on this shoulder I can just lift out a little bit of paint to give a highlight on that edge, and I could also lift out a little bit on her hat to give a highlight on that edge. So anytime you've put paint down and then you want to get a little bit of highlight, you can use one of these little brushes that are designed, or you can buy an acrylic brush that's got nice softish but stiff bristles that's just tiny, and they're just great for lifting out colour. If you've used Ultramarine Blue, going to be much easier to lift colour from your painting. So this is, you know, pretty much finished. I did on this corner, I've done 3 of these paintings now, and you would think I would know, but I missed out a rock on the corner here, so I put that in as well afterwards. And of course you can still see where I've put it in, because anytime you have dry paint you get a dry line. But I didn't like that empty spot just there. It wasn't there in the photo. So we've lifted out a little bit of colour from the person. If you felt like you'd lifted out too much and you felt that was too light, you can go back in with, I'm going to add a little bit of Gamboge with a tiny bit of crimson, and I'm going to put a sort of an orangey glow on her coat, and just mix that in with a wet brush, and just gives a little bit of light and shade on the figure. Again, if you feel like you still want a bit more shade on the figure, I've got the grey now, and you can manipulate with the grey as well. If you feel like you've lifted out too much, you can always put a little bit of shadow back in with a little bit of the grey. Just a back and forth sort of a thing. And when it's dry the next day, it's a really good time to look at it and see if there's anything that you need to fix up or anything that you don't like. And remember that your little brush, I don't need to take anything out here, but with my little brush that's used for lifting, I could always lift out a little bit of this cloud if I thought it was too dark, or I could lift something out of the sky if I thought it was too dark. And if you're actually doing rocks where you want light and dark, I didn't on these, but if you did want to do rocks where you want light and dark, you definitely need a Kleenex in your hand as well. But if that was the case and you've got ultramarine blue in your mix, you can go over the dry paint with this little lifting tool, and very carefully you can lift out highlights on your rocks if that's a look that you are going for. And then you just give a little dab with your Kleenex and it gives you some light and dark on the rocks, which is much easier than trying to put the light and dark in as you're painting them, which is very, very tricky. Maybe I'll leave this one with some light and dark. I kind of liked it. Silhouette, maybe a little bit of light here catching from the sunrise, just a little bit right there. And also if you had lost the light on top of your bench, you could put it back in if you'd lost it. Anytime you've lost light and you've used an ultramarine blue, you can get it back again with a little tiny brush and some water and a Kleenex, and you can manipulate your paint. If this is like not soft enough for you, you can manipulate it into a softer look. So much easier to do a day after you've painted when it's bone dry, and you can actually look at it and make some decisions after you've kind of walked away from it and left it for a few hours. So there we go, this one's finished, my third one. Don't like the mistake I made over here. Maybe I'll just put a bit more paint on there. It might cover it up a little bit. I don't think anybody else is going to know that it's there. It's just me. I know that it's there. And every time I do one of these as a demo, I don't paint as well as if I'm painting quietly by myself. And that's just the nature of things. And you too, while you're doing the lessons, watching me, it's probably much harder to paint than if you're just sitting nice and quiet and doing it in your own time. So thanks for joining me. We'll see you again next time. And keep painting and keep enjoying your painting. Bye for now. Well, I hope your sunrise turned out well. You can imagine it's you sitting on that bench looking out there early in the morning. So we'll see you again next week. Thanks for joining me.